I'm very pleased to be chairing this session with my very admired colleagues. I'm Barbara Mundy. I'm a professor of Latin American art history at Tulane University in New Orleans. And I have the good fortune to be at the Newberry this calendar year as the David Wagner Distinguished Fellow. The panel today is on the environment, and we have three distinguished speakers. I'll introduce them right before their papers, and then I'll invite the speakers up to the podium, and we'll have time for discussion and to take questions for the audience. We'll be ending promptly at 5 minutes to 5, to allow us a little bit of time before our keynote. Our second speaker is Ruel Pangunsan, who is the Associate Professor of History at the University of Philippines, Diliman, whose work looks at Philippine environmental history, the history of science, and diplomatic history. Today, he's going to be presenting a paper called Naming the Vernacular, Philippine Coastal Natures in Colonial Biological Inventories. Please join me in welcoming Raul.
Good afternoon, everyone. Maraming salamat for the invitation. And from wax, let us go to mangroves. So presenting on vernacular ecologies, Barbara emailed us and shared a panel question about the antithesis of local vernacular ecologies or knowledge. Through mangroves, I would like us to think about coastal ecologies not just as a global scientific environment, but as a local and cultural understanding of and how it could provide a glimpse of early Philippine lives. So let me start from this late 18th century document prepared for the Spanish Naval Office in Madrid, which describes a coastal town in the provincial island of Samar in central Philippines. It opens with a beautiful description of the estuary leading to the settlement area. The report says, the multitude of mangroves in that area wrestle in their natural warm tropical regions, always bathing in the tip of marine waters with their trunks subdivided into various woody roots and their very thick spikes are exposed. Approaching the port was difficult because of the strong current. The estuary, long and curvy as described in the report, was surrounded with mangroves at both sides, providing sailors easier navigation towards the town. Similarly, the Malaspina expedition, when its crew arrived in Samar in 1792, provided descriptions of the island's lowland ecologies, lowland and coastal areas, noticing the muddy estuaries and leafy fields of the port to town, town proper. Mangroves are crucial in the Philippine estuarine life. Contemporary scientists cite their importance, especially in coastal communities, describing them as a link between the land and the sea. The 18th century document emphasizes on the link as a space that protects inland settlements from the seawater surges. In this presentation, I look at early Philippine lives through the plants and ecologies that were important to early Filipinos. Mangroves and other estuarine plants, wetlands, and coastal ecologies characterize the kinds of Philippine environment in lowland communities, including early Christianized settlements and pueblos. They were part of Filipino economic, cultural, social, and even spiritual worlds. The Spanish Naval report mentioned earlier does not give details on fishing culture and other economic activities that would have offered us an idea on the role of mangroves in the local economic history during this period. But in another document, manuscript, a 17th century botanical inventory, which I think is displayed in the exhibit area, that allows us to have a glimpse of how mangroves and coastal plants were valuable to the locals. In the Declaración de las Virtudes de los Árboles y Plantas, or the Declaración of the Virtues of Trees and Plants, published posthumously in 1878 as an addendum to Manuel Blanco's Flora de Filipinas, Agustinian clergy Ignacio de Mercado listed 6 plants belonging to the mangrove family were classified as synonym of particular mangrove species according to the identification of contemporary scientists. Newberry has one of the copies of the Mercados Declaración. Scholars have examined the value of Mercados catalog, underscoring how these plants were important to the residents as food and medicine. The priest explained the pharmaceutical properties and essence of selected plants according to how the local inhabitants had utilized them. For example, the nipa plant, Mercado explained that aside from the popular local use of nipa for wine making, and as braided roof for local houses, the leaves were also utilized to cure or remedy insect bites. Mercado's inventory also gives us a glimpse of the vernacular ecologies in early Philippines. One feature of global botany was the creation of scientific names popularized by the lineage classification system. The original Mercado manuscript did not provide scientific names in his list, though he often utilized Spanish terms for certain plants. In this published version in 1936 with the Spanish History of Medicine Congress, scientific names were added, and some scientific names, including those mangrove plants, have been corrected by contemporary botanists. Early botanical inventories in colonial Philippines had rarely utilized European scientific classification, possibly for a reason that many of the plants which the Spaniards were documenting were new to them. They instead recorded the local plant names, devising a hybrid system that combined native terms and Hispanic and Mexican names. Contact period and early inventories of Philippine ecologists furnish the vernacular names of plants that would serve as important in the documentation and foundational knowledge of what we call now as Philippine studies, or specifically Philippine biology. In the Declaración, Mercado listed the plants that thrive in mangrove swamps and estuarine habitats and identified them in their local names, such as malaraya, bakong, tabigit, and manunggal. Many of these names are not widely used today. Now, we generally use the term bakawan to refer to mangrove plants. The archiving of Philippine ecologies, such as the one by Mercado, reveals the multiple names which early Filipinos had attached to botanical species surrounding them. Another inventory that was produced by the Spaniards was that of naturalist Juan de Cuellar, was assigned to the Philippines in the late 18th century as resident scientist of Philippine Royal Company. One of Cuellar's most significant works was an index to local species listed according to plants indicated in Hortus indicus malabaricus. Hortus is a 12-volume work containing descriptions and exquisite illustrations of over 700 um, uh, Indian plants compiled by a Dutch East India Company commander in Malabar. Published between 1678 and 1693, the compilation is regarded as the first authoritative study of South Asian flora. Cuellar seemed to personally resolve to replicate Hortus in Philippine flora. He accomplished 10 volumes, unpublished, however. In the complete index, Cuellar identified over 200 Tagalog names for species listed in Hortus. For some plants, such as papaya, anyil, the names are apparently of Latin American or Castilian origin, indicating that the species were introduced to the Philippines possibly through the Galion. Some of the names, such as Pantakake, are shared across Southeast Asian region, while others are seemingly forgotten or are no longer used today. By and large, the index serves as a historical repository of vernacular Philippine natural history, preserving the linguistic and cultural heritage despite the homogenizing process of colonialism. Aside from replicating the Hortus, Cuellar also created a list of Philippine woods, such as this one. This is just a sample of the list of Philippine woods, which were sent also to Madrid. The list enumerated 120 names of trees on Philippine soil. Scholars have argued that such inventories can serve as an apparatus which at least provide a synoptic view of the practices that shape the acquisition of knowledge and the creation of natural history. While the list lacks the prose that can supply outright description, it nonetheless furnishes a window through which to interrogate the process of mapping and listing of biological elements. Quilliar created the inventory following the technique that naturalists use to monitor large-scale collection and circulation of specimens. Mangroves figured prominently in the place-making history and heritage of many coastal towns and estuarine communities in the Philippines. The name itself of Manila, country's capital, is generally assumed to have been obtained from nilad or nilar, one of the Tagalog names for a mangrove tree under the Rubiaceae family. In his accounts in early 20th century, American botanist Elmer Merrill reiterated Spanish documentation that the name of Manila came from this plant as it was abundant then in the area. Many villages in the municipalities throughout the country, such as Hagonoy, Kulasi, Balibago, Dongon, have derived their names from the mangrove species that thrive in this area, Muriel, however, also reported that the original vegetation of Manila and its vicinities was predominantly mangrove. However, what remained, as he observed in early 20th century, were vestiges of mangrove swamps along tidal streams and muddy waters. American reports during this period pointed out the increasing use of mangrove trees as firewood. Such depiction was possibly true also in Spanish period, especially in the 19th century. Archival records during the Spanish colonial regime mention the wide selling of leña, or firewood. The industrialization of Manila and other urban areas during the 19th century intensified the utilization of coastal and mangrove plants as fuels. As present-day geopolitics and notions of modernity have shifted more towards inland perspective, the role of mangroves in the heritage and history of these communities seem to have been forgotten. The Philippine lives that revolve around the estuarine cultures and mangrove habitats had slowly been ignored. The colonial archives in general offer limited information, but these colonial botanical inventories are cracks in the parchment curtain that reveal about the early Philippine lives that centered on coastal and estuarine environment, including Philippine vernacular ecologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruel, for that fascinating paper. We now have our last member of the panel, and I'd like to introduce Ricardo Padron, who's a professor of Spanish at the University of Virginia, and he studies the literature and culture of early modern Hispanic world, particularly questions of space, empire, and cartography. He'll be talking today about revisiting a monument of Philippine cartography. Welcome, please welcome to the podium, Ricardo Padron.
I'd like to join everyone before I start in echoing the thanks that have been given to the organizers, especially to Leah and Izzy, who are manning the table over here. And share my admiration of the colleagues from the Philippines who are doing this with industrial strength jet lag. That's something I really admire. So did we all see the map over in the other room? Yeah, so everyone's seen it. We've seen it's big, that it's pretty, that it's impressive. And it is probably the most well-known map of the Philippines from among historical documents. Why is this? First of all, before I get into this, I need to deflate expectations. There's been a lot said about this map, so I'm not necessarily going to say anything new. I am revisiting, in other words, some things that I've said in print and some other things that other people have said in print as a way of getting this map into our conversation. One of the reasons this is important, the Murillo Velarde map, is best understood when we look at it in the context of what came before. The first time that the Philippines appears in a printed map published under the auspices of the Spanish crown is in this map of the Indies that appears as part of the Descripción de las Indias of Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas, an official history of the Spanish Empire. And what you'll see is it maps the Philippines, as well as other parts of East Asia, as a Western extension of the American New World. This map comes accompanied by the first Spanish map of East and Southeast Asia, or what the Spaniards called the Indies of the West. And you'll see that the Philippines appear as a set of really, I hate to use the word crude, but crudely drawn islands with a general sense that you have one big island in the north, Luzon, one big island in the south, Mindanao, and then a lot of small islands in between, but with no real accurate rendering, no attempt really to accurately render the geography of these islands. Now, there's a lot that happens between 1601 and the next map that I'm going to show you. In other words, the Philippines are being depicted in maps that are devoted exclusively to the archipelago, the rare instance, and then in maps of East Asia, maps of the world. So the cartographic depiction of the Philippines is changing between 1601 and this map, which is actually my favorite map of the Philippines, done by two Spanish military officers in 1727. Now, what's happening here? This is actually an extraordinarily beautiful engraving. The only surviving copy is in the British Library, part of the loot that the British seized in Manila when they took the city during the 7 Years' War. And what you'll see is that for the first time, an official Spanish map is not depicting the Philippines as a part of an American empire. In other words, we're seeing the Philippines form part of a larger region that includes the coast of China to the north, what we now know as Indonesia to the south. But notice, I want to show you some details that tell us that that old idea of the Philippines as the Indies of the West is still present on this map. We're going to zoom in on a couple of details. First, the little allegory in the upper right. I hope you can see it well enough. It's an allegorical impression of the arrival of Catholicism in the Philippines. You'll see it's the faith in sort of a maritime chariot being pulled by these dolphins with the lions of Castile and Leon with their swords in the back. So here we have an allegory of the Spanish conquest as a Christian enterprise. And of course, where is it coming from? It's coming from across the Pacific, from the Americas. And then in the lower right, in this little cartouche that provides the scale of leagues in the map, you'll see these two allegorical figures, one on either side. The person on the right is clearly a personification of an exoticized Asian, a turban, not a lot of clothing, but holding a book. The person on the left-hand side is absolutely a personification of America. They have the attributes of the American Indian with the feathered headdress and the bow and arrows. So even though this map is depicting the Philippines no longer as a part of a new world that begins in Brazil and ends in Manila, you'll see how it's clinging to that idea of the Philippines as a westward expansion of an imperial project that is spread across the Pacific. Now, this map was made in 1727. The Murillo Velarde map was made only 7 years later, really kind of a short time to switch cartographic projects in which there's been tremendous investment. One of the reasons for this is because the depiction of the Philippines is still rather poor here. And what do I mean by poor? A lot of people, when they talk about the history of cartography, there's this resistance to talking about increasing accuracy in maps. We want to talk about other things about maps. But accuracy matters. Accuracy matters, especially if you're using that map to sail your ship. I think people who deconstruct maps are clearly not sailors who need to know where currents are, how to get through straits, where's the water shallow and dangerous, so forth and so on. And these are the interests that inform the creation of the Velarde maps, the need of the Spanish Empire for a reliable nautical chart of the islands. And so the map that replaces it is the Murillo Velarde map. And if you want to get an idea of how much better it is, the easiest way to appreciate The improvement in the cartographic depiction of the islands is to look at the island of Mindanao. For people who might need a little help with Philippine geography, if you see that compass rose sort of in the bottom middle, Mindanao is the large island right above the compass rose. And I want you to look at Mindanao, see how its shape changes, and see how its relationship to the rest of the archipelago changes. So Mindanao now is at the bottom, and what you'll see is that Velarde, one of the things he's done is not only has he improved the outline of the island itself, but he's brought it closer to the Visayas in order to more accurately capture the fact that Mindanao is separated from the Visayas by a much narrower body of water than what we see in the Romero Gandia map. So that's kind of a handy way of being able to compare these two maps and the enormous improvement in accuracy. However, what makes this map so important in Philippine history and Philippine culture is not necessarily that it's an accurate nautical chart, it's that it's everything else. Notice one of the things that has happened here is that we seem to have gotten away from that tendency to link the Philippines to the New World. In other words, this map is famous because it depicts the Philippines not only accurately, but more or less on their own. We've got that little piece of Borneo on the lower left, but otherwise what we're seeing are the islands of the archipelago, the islands that will later become the nation of the Philippines. And it's clear that this map is invested in a lot more than just nautical information. We have, for example, that legend, we'll see a little close-up of it later with the little lion's head, which is a history of the discovery and conquest of the Philippines by Spain and a list of different products, different institutions. We'll see in the upper right the coat of arms of the kings of Spain. And the thing that I am ignoring, but that you're probably all looking at, is the series of just fascinating vignettes, some of them ethnographic illustrations, some of them maps on both sides of the map that seem to be trying to capture something about Philippine life. One of the interesting things about this map, we saw in the Romero Gandia map that America was still there in the form of that allegorical personification of the continent. There are no personifications of America anywhere on this map, and no figure that can be identified as an American Indian. And just to give you an idea of something else that's going on, it's not just a matter of increasing accuracy. What I've done is I've taken my images and I've resized them so that they're proportional to each other. In other words, the Velarde map is the background here, and if we take that as our default, you can see that the Romero Gandia map is actually significantly smaller, and the maps from Antonio de Herrera, they're bound in a book, so we're talking about even larger maps. So not only are we improving the cartographic description of the Philippines, not only are we cropping out everything from around the Philippines, but we're also zooming in a tremendous way that allows representing the archipelago with a level of detail that we'd never seen before. So far, that's the introduction to the map. The map's creator is a Jesuit, Pedro Murillo Velarde, who was a faculty member of a Philippine university, very well versed in history and geography. He also wrote a 10-volume universal geography. And this is not the only map he made. Some other maps of his have survived, but he made many other maps of the Philippine archipelago that have since been lost. We know that they existed. They decorated the walls of the university where he worked, but they haven't come down to us. Two questions then. What exactly are we looking at? And second, how did this thing get to be made? One of the complicated things about early modern maps is that they appear in the archives, usually with very little accompanying documentation. In other words, the map is there with very little to tell us who made it. Here we know a who, but we know very little about how. What were the sources that were used? Were there surveys that were taken? Were people interviewed? Things like that. And so other people who have studied this map more closely than I have told us that, first of all, there are other nautical charts of the Philippine Islands that Velarde is using and that which he is in effect correcting on the basis of knowledge that he has collected. In my opinion, the single most important piece of scholarship on this map out there is by Mark Dizon, How to Read a Map, Global and Local Circulations on Pedro Murillo Velarde's map of the Philippines in the Colonial Latin American Review, which our friend Dana Leibson edits. And so I'm going to channel a little bit of Mark's work. He's an assistant professor at the Ateneo de Manila, because one of the things he's done is he's gone to other documents to figure out which were the places in the Philippines that Velarde actually visited himself. So in other words, where could he have been to talk with people, to collect information that he could have used in constructing his map? But perhaps what's even more interesting from Dizon's argument is that we're zooming in on a detail from the northern part of Luzon. Now, if we look at the map on the left, this map that Mark Dizon has created to chart Velarde's travels, you'll see that Velarde never went very far north in the island of Luzon, but we have this detail in Luzon. He identifies this camino. Aquí se halle un camino que en tres días se pasa a la parte de Cagayan. So a road that is going to connect central Luzon to northern Luzon. Where is this thing coming from? What Mark has been able to do is he's been able to identify an indigenous source for this knowledge. In other words, in a series of conflicts to try to assert Spanish control over northern Luzon in the first half of the 18th century, there's appointments of missionaries, interview some indigenous people from the island, and they're the ones who talk about this road. Turns out that the road doesn't exist. So in other words, these indigenous people are actually providing secondhand knowledge of their own that it turned out wasn't very reliable. So here we have something on the map that comes from an indigenous source. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring up Mark Dizon's argument, because the other two papers were very good at getting us away from imperial knowledge making, imperial discourses, imperial industries, towards local knowledge. And it would be wonderful to find out what kind of local knowledge is behind this map. But however many people have studied it, this is the only thing we've discovered so far. Now, it could be that there is a lot of indigenous knowledge, indigenous Philippine knowledge all over the map. The problem is trying to document it. In other words, where was Velarde? Who did he talk to? What kind of information was available, whether in cartographic form or in terms of oral traditions, local knowledge, things of this nature. So we have a map that is very much a representation of the Philippines that is appealing to Philippine nationalism, that is something like a foundational text in the story of Philippine identity, but where there is an undetermined amount of local Philippine knowledge traveling to this center of knowledge creation, Manila, where Velarde is putting things together and making his map. So one of the things that we're seeing is a map made of heterogeneous sources. Even though it only has one author, there are all kinds of sources of information, not to mention the very concrete contributions of two Tagalog artists, Nicolás de la Cruz Bagay and Francisco Suarez. Nicolás de la Cruz was the engraver who made the copper plates for the main map, and Francisco Suarez is the artist responsible for the illustrations on the other side. But what are we looking at? The map is full of details that actually connect the Philippines to other itineraries, other places, other imperial projects. For example, here in this detail from the northern half of Luzon, you can see all of these European-style ships. There's also a Chinese junk. But there are European-style ships and routes marked out, because one of the purposes of the map is to think through which are the best routes by which the Manila galleon can approach the island and leave the island. In other words, what's safe in terms of sailing conditions, in terms of exposure to pirates. Another detail, As I mentioned before, this legend includes a mini history of the discovery and conquest of the Philippines by Spain and a list of colonial institutions like monasteries. You'll see that the ship at the bottom, La Nau Victoria, is actually Magellan's flagship. So Magellan's voyage, that crucial voyage that for the first time connects these islands to the Spanish Empire, is actually commemorated on the Murillo Velarde map. One of the curious things is where Murillo Velarde places Manila. He gives its longitude as 158 degrees, 30 minutes east. Its actual longitude is 121 degrees east. So there's a more than 30-degree error in his longitude. Is this an error, or is this an attempt to situate the islands solidly in the Spanish side of the world as defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas? So here's another possibility where, science is in service of an imperial project and of it advancing an imperial claim over the archipelagos. And finally, he makes it a point to point out, as a good Jesuit, that St. Francis Xavier had visited the island of Mindanao and thereby connects the islands not to the Spanish imperial project, but to the Jesuit evangelical project in Asia. So a map that on the face of it seems to be a map of the archipelago alone, so sort of like a declaration of cartographic independence, we might say, but when examined much more closely, is seen to map the island into these larger imperial networks and projects. So the question becomes, and this is how I'm going to end, this is my last slide, what do we do with these images? It seems that here is where we find the local Philippine realities rather than imperial projects. But I'm going to leave you with this one observation. When we look at these images, I've eliminated the maps and I've just included the ethnographic images. Where do we find native Filipinos? In other words, people that the map identifies as Indios Filipinos. It's in these circled places. So we see that Manila is depicted as very much an indigenous space. That street scene is full of indigenous people. But then we have a number of sort of casta paintings that are depicting whites, Chinese, various kinds of Asians, Africans in the lower left. In other words, there is a disproportionate interest in populations that are not Philippine. In other words, once again, that interest in the cosmopolitan and imperial nature of the islands rather than in its own identity. And then when we look at what I think of as these very strange scenes from the country, we have two country scenes, and what Martizan suggests is that what Velarde has done is he's had a conversation with the artist and has talked about the things that have stuck out in his mind from the travels around the Philippines, and they've been consolidated into these two images that try to capture what is distinctive of the islands. But what that tells us is that these are not images of real places. In other words, they are they're collages of sorts. They're synthetic images that try to turn the tremendous diversity of the islands into and sort of boil them down into these kind of typical scenes. I'm thinking in Spanish, these costumbrista scenes of lo típico Filipino. So I'll leave you with that question. What are we looking at? And what is the line between the local and the imperial on this monument from Philippine cartography? Thank you. And let's leave that for the discussion.
Fabulous. Thank you to our speakers. I'd invite everyone up to the podium so we can have a little conversation. I'll start with a question or two for the speakers, and then we will have time to discuss. If you'd like to ask questions of each other, I invite that as well. And we will also have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. And I was really struck in all these papers how particularly in the second paper, in Ruel's paper, you were talking about these kind of vernacular ecologies, and I think Dana brought up, you didn't use that term at all, but talking about vernacular knowledge and local ethnographic knowledge, which for me implies a distinction between the local and then everything else. And Ricardo, you're talking about an imperial set of knowledges that is distinctly not local. But I would like to pose the question to everyone: is what is the antithesis of local knowledge? Is it not just another form of localism, or are we looking at really two distinct camps of knowledge, the local and then the non-local or everything else? And what constitutes that opposite of the local?
Could I provide a map-biased answer?
Sure.
Most of the navigation over history has been done without maps. Nautical charts are a fairly recent invention. The standard is, there's a whole sort of battle that has taken place to standardize navigational knowledge in cartographic form. And so what I call the opposite of local knowledge, and what I think I mean by imperial knowledge, is knowledge that travels. In other words, knowledge that is legible in different locations because it obeys a grammar, a syntax, a vocabulary, rules of discourse that have been universalized, usually through the operation of a marketplace, a colonial project, an imperial project. I was thinking, Ruel, when you were talking about the word mangrove, because I think one of the things that imperial knowledge, if I can call it that, or non-local knowledge does with the tropics is it tries to make the tropics interchangeable, So many colonial projects have to do with taking plants that grow in one place, pineapples, and making them grow in another place. And so I wondered about the word mangrove. And is the word mangrove not in itself the kind of traveling knowledge or universal knowledge that I'm talking about? What are we losing when we call these Philippine plants mangroves rather than using a local name? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It kicks it to you, too.
Yeah, I think similarly, I think the global botany has this way of universalizing plants and animals, the flora and fauna, through universal classification system, perhaps popularized by the Linnean classification system. So the idea of perhaps the antithesis of it would be to look into plants, local plants, through its own local names, through its vernacular names, and also, I think, secondly, through how would local people utilize them. When you say classification system, normally it comes with descriptive annotation of the physical features of this plant, of this flora. I think vernacular knowledge, vernacular botany would also offer a different kind of description. How locals would use them spiritually, economically, medically. So I think description-wise and even how local people would utilize them offers us to think about vernacular knowledge, vernacular ecologies. Yeah.
I'm going to go off script, which is rare for me, and push you on this question, because in some ways, for me, the whole notion of a non-local is deeply tied with the colonial project, be it an evangelization project or a claim to kind of universal knowledge. But because this panel is about the environment, and all environments are at their base local, could you think about the implications of a kind of global environment or a global claim to knowledge about environmental phenomena, and the pushback we actually see to that whole edifice today as we confront very local challenges to a changing climate? Like, how have those knowledge systems gotten us where we are today, and can we think about them differently to address a really contemporary problem?
Okay, I'm going to think out loud here.
Good.
I have in mind reading I've been doing in the ontological turn in anthropology, right? And what anthropologists like Viveros de Castro are insisting on is this kind of incredibly, radically untranslatable nature of local knowledges, to use that word for what he would call an ontology. And what I would suggest is that when we say a global environment or global knowledge of the environment, we're actually passing into a form of imperial knowledge in the sense that, we're creating a global category that is somehow usable to understand all kinds of local phenomena and local things. But we don't think of that as a bad thing, because here we're talking about a universal knowledge that enables perhaps collaboration across localities, constructive solutions, a language in which we can translate the environmental issues of one place, or at least get them into conversation with the environmental issues of another place. So, I think it's easy for us in colonial studies to make universal projects the bad guy, because in the field that we study, it's so clear that they've been used for purposes of exploitation, oppression, extraction, environmental degradation. But where would we be if we didn't have some kind of universal vocabulary to mediate different kinds of local things? I'm thinking about this map and I'm wondering, is there really any knowledge here that we would call environmental? I'm not even sure how that word applies to an 18th century map, which is so poor on a lot of the things that we might associate with the environment. This doesn't tell us anything about climate. It doesn't tell us anything about vegetation, about the enormous deforestation that took place in the construction of Manila galleons. So there's a lot of interesting environmental knowledge that's actually missing here. So that's what I say, when we start talking about things environmentally, maybe this is we're doing something universalizing, but maybe constructive.
For me, what comes to mind would be one application of creating global knowledge for plants would be the introduction of foreign plants to local communities. I think the introduction of exotic plants to a particular area denotes that some certain plants can be applied, can be planted, can be cultivated in colonies, in territories, thinking that there's a universality of these plants. And 2 centuries after, there will be implication to climate change. How these introduced plants, how these exotic plants would turn out to be biologically hazardous or biologically unimportant to local ecologies. I think questions of how to mitigate them, how to remove them, are also connected to this colonial changing of the local landscape.
So this might be this might launch more questions for our audience, but I want to turn now to another question, because this is really a conference about the Philippines, and all of you have described cases that almost could happen in any colonial space. Wax is produced in the Maya land as well, and we have maps produced in other ways. So could you tell us what is distinctive about the Philippine case?
The uniqueness of these plants are also localized. I think there's no question about how certain knowledge are applicable as. And I would say about certain uses and knowledge are basically local. So I think same true with plants. The way they were appreciated, the way they were documented, were meant to be localized. And the coming of European science, the coming of global science, would perhaps shift this kind of usage, this kind of knowledge to a more universal appreciation of these local plants. So for me, it's local.
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm a little resistant to the question, largely because I think that people in Philippine studies are often faced with this. An intellectual establishment that sees Spain, Mexico, and Peru as sort of the obvious places to study the early modern Hispanic world. And as soon as I move out to a place that's conceived as peripheral, whether it's the Rio de la Plata, Ecuador, Puerto Rico, or the Philippines, all of a sudden you have to justify yourself. I've hit a nerve there with you. Yeah.
No, I think you misunderstood my
Yeah.
question.
Yeah,
In that
okay.
I don't believe me. I've worked on many
Yeah, yeah.
peripheries.
Yeah.
And but again, what does the case of the Philippines, because it's not New Spain,
Right.
what does it add to our understanding of, say, the larger processes of the Iberian world? And what-
I think that the connection of the Iberian world with larger processes of globalization is completely incomprehensible without the Philippines. Without the Philippines, we understand the Iberian world as an Atlantic phenomenon, not a global one. We don't understand how it was. We actually don't understand how the Spanish Empire happened. Because without that silver trade, as I think has been amply demonstrated,
Right.
The Atlantic slave trade wouldn't have gotten off the ground. Maybe this just tells you how much I've drunk the Kool-Aid here, but I think we've really passed the point of thinking of the Philippines as a periphery that, when well understood, enhances our understanding of the Iberian world. It's a crucial component. If we're not understanding the Philippines, the Trans-Pacific trade, the relation with Asia, we're simply not understanding the way the early modern world worked.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I'm sorry, and this map is a big part of that.
Yeah. Thank you. We now have some time for questions from the audience, and I think Leah might have yeah. So we have a question there, yeah. Could you identify yourself first and then ask your question?
My name is Kyle. I'm a regular attendee at some of the Newberry Library Renaissance Center for Renaissance Studies events. I just come here every once in a while. But I had a question for just all three presenters. Just this idea of what you related to the environment of the this notion of how the early modern period in the all three of your papers suggest this notion, this idea of imperial globalization and how it relates to the environment. And I'm just curious about how can you relate that to the current day ecological catastrophes that are happening in the Philippines today? You have this case I saw in The Guardian the other day about how Philippine survivors of a typhoon are trying to hold a global shell company of responsible for some of the catastrophes that have happened with the typhoons or something. So I'm just curious if the environment, you can tie this idea to imperialism today in a sort of modern day contemporary sense. I don't know, just some ideas there.
Great, thank you for that. So asking us to think more deeply about the connection between contemporary crisis and that is an imperial project and these colonial phenomena we're looking at.
Perhaps for me, I started this project with contemporary notions, contemporary views about mangroves, and how scientists and environmentalists would, I think, point out to the lack of mangroves in various flooding experiences in the Philippines. So from those commentaries about the role of mangroves in flood control projects, that sort of made me to think about how to think about mangroves historically. So I went back to the records, I went back to the archives, and how they were documented and how they were archived and recorded based on how it was appreciated, and perhaps the growth of urban projects in the Philippines contributed to this vanishing role or vanishing mangroves in many coastal areas in the Philippines. Yeah.
I find that the question very difficult to answer because, to some extent, uh, it asks a question that I always struggle with. What is the relevance of studying the past to the problems of today? If I'm interested in environmental issues, why study environmental degradation in the 16th century? Why not just plenty of environmental degradation right now? Let's get active. But I do think that when we talk about the past, we're always talking about the present. We're always the past is constantly changing, and it's changing as our own preoccupations, as our own concerns. And so, I've been really thinking about Michel de Certeau recently, who talks about historiography as a kind of dream work, where the past and the present mingle together in ways that might allow us to work out issues that are best worked out through a figurative process, through the diversion of history, rather than by tackling the present head on. Can I give you a concrete example? If I had some time to think about it, I might, but I think it has something to do with the fact that we have less of an investment in the past, oftentimes. And so there are some things that can be said more easily or more clearly than when we're talking about the present. But then, of course, it becomes the responsibility to circle around back to today.
And I'll just add to that. I work in central Mexico, and of course, there is an imaginary of a sustainable agriculture in the Valley of Mexico, in a kind of floating gardens of the Chinampas. They will never be realized today, but I think there's something very important, and I'm thinking about your image of the mangroves. I think it's very important to have an idea of a past landscape. Maybe not able to realize it today, but still to have some conception of a different path, of a different ecology. So for me, that gives me a kind of even though I know that there'll never be workable chinampas in the Valley of Mexico, I think it's still very important to think about that as obtainable in a different form, a more balanced relationship to a tree or to a swamp than exists today. So for me, that's how the history figures.
I was just going to comment that you said these images of tropical life in the Murillo Velarde map. I think wouldn't you say that they're really imaginings of a global tropical, in the sense that the image of the nangka tree with the big fruits on the trunk. These also come out in paintings of what is a tropical in South America, and of course the idea of indolence as shown by the person in the hammock. That's also that's a trope that's been used many times. And finally, the other side, the crocodiles are also. These are the animals associated, I think, with Africa. So also the notion of the exotic, and finally the snake eating the pig. Moving forward, this is used. This appears in the images of Gironier in 20 years in the Philippines, and it has also been discussed by Mary Pratt's in Imperial Eyes. So it's really not just it's really a longing for the tropical.
Yeah, I really love your interpretation of those images. I think you're spot on. And it strikes me to build on that remark that there's a contrast here between those two sort of dreams of the tropic images and then the precise cartographies, which are all of important nodes in the Spanish imperial built spaces of colonial reality. So there's a real contrast here between what is mapped and what is dreamt or imagined.
Please join me in thanking our three wonderful speakers for their wonderful papers.